November 15th, 2016. Miguel Herrera hadn't touched a weapon in 23 years. The man who once killed 7 DEA informants in a single night now changed oil filters in Miami. That changed when the video hit social media. Maria Escobar, Pablo's widow, pushed to the ground by some punk cartel kid outside Medellin grocery store. Spit on, laughed at, while hundreds watched and filmed. Miguel watched that video 47 times before he opened his safe. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay the Sig Sauer Pablo had given him the night before Medellin burned, along with 3 passports and a promise Miguel made to a dying king. The next morning, Miguel's auto shop sat empty. Security cameras showed him locking up at 6:47 a.m. He never came back. What happened next reminded the Colombian underworld why Pablo Escobar's ghost still had teeth, and why some loyalties run deeper than death itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, Miguel's biggest worry had been whether Mrs. Rodriguez would approve the estimate for her Honda's transmission. He'd built his life on predictable problems: leaking gaskets, worn brake pads, the occasional blown engine. Simple fixes for simple people who paid in cash and never asked questions about the accent he'd never quite shaken. The auto shop occupied a forgettable corner in Little Havana, squeezed between a botanica and a place that sold empanadas that tasted like cardboard. Miguel had chosen the location deliberately invisible, unremarkable, the kind of business that blended into Miami's sprawling anonymity. For 23 years, he'd arrived at 7, worked until 6, and went home to a studio apartment where he watched telenovelas and pretended his hands had only ever held wrenches. But hands remember what minds try to forget. Now, as Miguel's rental car carved through the Colombian darkness toward Medellin, those same hands gripped the steering wheel with the steady precision of a man who'd once orchestrated death from the shadows. The mountain roads twisted like a serpent's spine, each curve bringing him closer to a world he'd sworn to leave buried. The Sig Sauer rested in the passenger seat, still wrapped in Pablo's oilcloth. 23 years, and the weapon felt as familiar as his own heartbeat. Some muscle memory ran deeper than time. Miguel's phone buzzed against the dashboard, another notification from the video that had shattered his carefully constructed exile. The clip had gone viral in the way that violence always did, spreading through social media like digital wildfire. Comments poured in from keyboard warriors who thought they understood the significance of what they'd witnessed. They saw an old woman humiliated by a young punk. They didn't recognize the echo of a war most assumed had ended with Pablo's death on that Medellin rooftop in 1993. But Miguel recognized something else in the grainy footage: the way the kid moved, the tilt of his head when he laughed, the particular cruelty in his eyes that belonged to bloodlines, not circumstance. Pablo's blood ran in strange directions. The rental car's radio crackled with static as Miguel climbed higher into the mountains. Medellin's lights spread below like a constellation of broken promises, each glow representing lives caught between poverty and the promise of easy money. The city had tried to reinvent itself: tech innovation, urban transformation, the miracle of Medellin the politicians loved to tout. But Miguel knew that certain stains never washed clean. His phone rang, the display showing a Miami number he didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail, then another, then another. By the time he reached the outskirts of Medellin, 17 missed calls had accumulated like evidence of a life he'd abandoned without explanation. Carlos, his only employee, had probably arrived at the shop that morning to find the security gate still down and the office locked. Miguel almost smiled, imagining the confusion. Carlos was a good kid, too good for this business, really. He asked too many questions about Miguel's past and not enough about his paycheck. The type who still believed in heroes and villains, not understanding that most men were both. The video played again on Miguel's phone, the sound tinny through the device's small speakers. Maria's face, etched with 2 decades of grief and defiance, showed no fear even as the cartel punk shoved her to the pavement. She'd learned to expect betrayal from men who promised protection, but she still carried herself like royalty, even sprawled in market dirt with vegetables scattered around her like offerings to a fallen god. Pablo would have burned the city for less. Miguel remembered the last time he'd seen Maria: December 1993, 1 month after Pablo's death. She'd been packing what little the government hadn't seized, preparing for exile in Argentina with their children. Her eyes had held the hollow exhaustion of a woman who'd loved a monster and buried him anyway. protect them, Pablo had whispered in those final days, when the walls were closing in, and even legends faced mortality. Swear to me, Miguel, whatever happens to me, protect my family. The promise had seemed simple then. Pablo's enemies would die with him, and the empire he'd built would crumble into memory. Miguel would fade into anonymity, and the Escobar family would find peace in exile. For 23 years that peace had held, until some punk with familiar eyes decided to make a statement. Miguel pulled into a roadside hotel that looked like it hadn't been updated since the narco wars. The desk clerk, a rail-thin man with nervous eyes, barely glanced at the passport Miguel slid across the counter. Colombian ID, purchased that afternoon from a forger in Miami's underground network. Some skills, like certain loyalties, never fully expired. The room smelled of cigarettes and desperation. Miguel sat on the narrow bed and watched the video one more time, studying every detail, the angle of the camera, the faces in the crowd, the way security materialized just a little too late to help but perfectly positioned to record. This wasn't random violence, it was theater. Someone had staged Maria's humiliation, knowing exactly who would be watching. Now they were about to learn why legends never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to remind the world what fear tastes like. The hotel's thin walls carried the sound of trucks grinding up the mountain highway, their diesel engines laboring against gravity and time. Miguel lay on the sagging mattress, fully clothed, watching shadows from passing headlights sweep across water-stained wallpaper. Sleep wouldn't come. It never did when the past reached through decades to drag him back. In Miami, his studio apartment had been different. Clean white walls, no memories bleeding through the paint. A Murphy bed that folded away like his history. 3 blocks from the shop, close enough to walk when the nightmares made driving dangerous. He'd furnished it with deliberate emptiness. A television, a small table, 2 chairs, though he never had guests. The refrigerator held beer and leftover Chinese takeout. The freezer contained emergency cash wrapped in freezer bags, old habits disguised as paranoia. But there had been one photograph. Miguel reached for his wallet, extracting the creased picture he'd carried for 23 years. Pablo's family at Christmas, 1992. The last peaceful moment before the world collapsed. Maria wore a red dress, her smile genuine despite the storm clouds gathering around their empire. The children flanked their father Juan Pablo, serious even at 15, and little Manuela, gap-toothed and giggling on Pablo's lap. Behind them stood Miguel, younger then, his hand resting protectively on Juan Pablo's shoulder. He'd been more than Pablo's security chief. He'd been family. The memory tasted bitter now. Juan Pablo would be 38, probably still using the alias Roberto Escobar to escape his father's shadow. Manuela, 28, had reportedly struggled with the weight of being Pablo Escobar's daughter. Both had spent their adult lives running from a legacy written in blood and cocaine. And Maria, 61 now, still beautiful in the way that defied tragedy. The video had shown her visiting Medellin's Macarena market, the same place she'd shopped as a young mother when Pablo's money could buy anything except normalcy. Why had she returned? Argentina had granted the family asylum. She had grandchildren there, a quiet life built on the ruins of empire. Miguel's phone buzzed. Another Miami number, another unanswered call. Carlos again, probably. The kid would be worried, maybe angry. Miguel had left no note, no explanation, just locked the shop and vanished like smoke. It wasn't fair to Carlos, but fairness was a luxury Miguel couldn't afford. He thought about Carlos discovering the closed shop, the confusion giving way to concern as hours passed without word. Carlos believed Miguel was just a mechanic, a skilled one with mysterious past, sure, but fundamentally harmless. An old man who spoke little and worked hard, who sometimes went weeks without smiling but always paid fairly and never raised his voice. Carlos didn't know that Miguel's gentle hands had once broken men's fingers to extract information, that his patient demeanor had been cultivated in rooms where screaming was background music, that the scars on his knuckles came from interrogations, not engine blocks. The kid would wait, probably call the police eventually. File a missing person report that would go nowhere because Miguel Herrera, the identity he'd worn for 2 decades, was as manufactured as his story about fleeing political violence in the 80s. By the time authorities connected the dots, if they ever did, Miguel would either be dead or disappeared again. He'd built something in Miami, though, something small and real. Mrs. Rodriguez trusted him with her Honda. Carlos looked up to him like a father. The Cuban woman who ran the empanada shop always asked about his health, genuine concern in her weathered face. Simple connections, but precious for their simplicity. All of it abandoned now, sacrificed on the altar of an oath sworn in Pablo's final desperate hours. Miguel rose from the bed and moved to the window. Medellin sprawled below, transformed yet familiar. The favelas still climbed the mountainsides like concrete waterfalls, but new construction glittered in the valley shopping centers, apartment towers, the architectural optimism of a city trying to forget its sins. The metro ran clean lines through neighborhoods that had once been war zones. Progress, they called it. Evolution. But certain things remained constant. Power still flowed to those willing to spill blood for it. The poor still chose between starvation and trafficking. And family blood, and chosen still, mattered more than law. The kid in the video had Pablo's swagger, that particular arrogance that came from believing your name made you untouchable. Miguel had watched Pablo cultivate that same confidence in his own children, teaching them that Escobar blood carried both privilege and burden. The family name opened doors and painted targets simultaneously. Now someone was using that name as a weapon against Maria. Miguel returned to the bed, but sleep remained elusive. Outside, Colombia's mountains held their eternal watch, indifferent to human ambition and suffering. In a few hours he would begin hunting through a city that had buried its past beneath metropolitan dreams. But the past had a way of resurging, like groundwater seeping through concrete. 23 years of peace, ended by 90 seconds of viral video. Some prices were worth paying. Some promises were worth keeping, even when they led home to violence. He showered in water that barely qualified as warm, the ancient pipes groaning protests that echoed through the building's skeleton. In the cracked mirror, a stranger stared back. Or maybe it was the man he'd been before Miguel Herrera the mechanic had ever existed. The soft edges that 23 years of honest work had carved into his features seemed to have sharpened overnight, revealing the predator beneath. The hotel's lobby smelled of instant coffee and broken dreams. Miguel paid in cash, ignoring the desk clerk's curious glance at his untouched bed. Outside, Medellin's morning rush hour moved with the chaotic rhythm of a city that had learned to function despite itself. Street vendors hawked newspapers and fruit from pushcarts, their voices mixing with motorcycle exhaust, and merengue bleeding from open doorways. Miguel walked toward the city center, muscle memory guiding him through streets that had been reborn but never truly changed. New facades covered old wounds, but he could still read the city's scars, a bullet hole filled with concrete here, a memorial plaque where a car bomb had erased a city block there. Medellin wore its transformation like expensive makeup over bruised skin. His phone vibrated. Not a call this time, but a text from an unknown number. Miguel. We need to talk. Café Versalles, 1 hour. Come alone. The message carried no signature, but Miguel's blood turned to ice water. 3 people in the world knew his real name, and 2 of them were supposed to be dead. He stopped walking, other pedestrians flowing around him like water around a stone, and stared at the screen until the words burned into his retinas. Café Versalles. He knew the place, had known it 23 years ago, when it served as neutral ground for negotiations between families who painted Medellin's streets red. If it still existed, if this wasn't some elaborate trap, then someone from the old world had surfaced. Someone who remembered when Miguel Herrera meant something more dangerous than transmission repairs. His hands didn't shake as he typed back, "Who is this?" The response came immediately, "Someone who knows why you really came home." Miguel deleted both messages and continued walking, but his pace had quickened. The Sig Sauer pressed against his ribs like a familiar friend, its weight both comforting and terrifying. He'd carried weapons for so long that their absence in Miami had felt like nakedness. Now, surrounded by the mountains that had witnessed his rise and fall, the gun felt like destiny. Café Versalles occupied the same corner it had in 1993, though the building around it had been modernized beyond recognition. Glass and steel reached toward the sky where colonial architecture had once crumbled under the weight of history. Miguel approached from across the street, studying the establishment through new eyes. The outdoor seating area buzzed with young professionals and university students, their laptops and smartphones, marking them as citizens of a different Colombia than the one he'd left behind. But violence had a way of transcending generations. Miguel spotted him before he'd crossed the street. Third table from the corner, back to the wall, wearing a guayabera that had gone out of style during the Clinton administration. Older now, gray threading through hair that had once been midnight black, but the posture was unmistakable. Carlos Henao sat nursing an espresso like he had all the time in the world. Pablo's brother-in-law, Maria's brother, a man who'd supposedly died in a DEA raid in 1999. Miguel felt the last 23 years collapse like a house of cards. Every carefully constructed day in Miami, every lie he'd told himself about redemption and peace, every moment he'd believed the past would stay buried, all of it crumbled as he stared at a ghost made flesh. Carlos looked up as Miguel approached, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth that held no warmth. "You look old, hermano," Carlos said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Miami must agree with you." Miguel sat slowly, every instinct screaming at him to run. "You're supposed to be dead." "So are you." Carlos sipped his espresso, studying Miguel over the rim. "Yet here we are, two ghosts drinking coffee in the new Colombia. Funny how things work out. The video was meant for you, only you." Carlos set down his cup with deliberate precision. "My nephew got a little carried away with his performance, but the message was clear enough. Maria needed help, and only one man alive would care enough to answer that call." Miguel's world shifted on its axis. The careful life he'd built, the peace he'd cultivated, the promise he'd thought he was keeping, all of it had been orchestrated. "Welcome home, Miguel. We have work to do." "I don't know what game you're playing," Miguel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not interested." Carlos laughed, a sound like broken glass. "Game? This isn't a game, hermano. This is family business." He leaned forward and Miguel caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something else, the metallic tang of fear that even dead men carried. "My sister is being humiliated in the streets by our own blood. You think that's a game? Your nephew, Pablo's Eduardo. Pablo's sister's boy, may she rest in peace." Carlos's expression darkened. Little shit thinks the family name gives him license to forget respect, to forget who protected this family when the world wanted us all dead. Miguel pushed back from the table, chair scraping against concrete. "I'm not that man anymore." "No?" Carlos pulled out his phone, fingers dancing across the screen. Within seconds, Miguel's device buzzed. A photograph filled his screen, the auto shop in Miami, Carlos standing beside a Honda Civic with a wrench in his hand, confusion written across his young features. Miguel's breath caught. "You touch that boy and You'll what? You're here, he's there, and my associates are very impatient people." Carlos pocketed his phone with deliberate slowness. "Relax, hermano. Young Carlos is safe, for now. Think of it as insurance that you'll listen." The words hit Miguel like physical blows. In trying to protect his old life, to maintain distance from this conversation, he'd exposed the only innocent person who mattered to him. His chest tightened, the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders like a shroud. "What do you want?" Carlos signaled the waitress for another espresso, the gesture casual as ordering death. "Eduardo thinks he's building his own organization, moving product through routes his uncle established, using fear tactics that would make Pablo proud, but he's sloppy, greedy. And now he's turned his attention to Maria. Why? Because she knows things, locations, passwords, routes that were never written down, only whispered between family." Carlos paused as the waitress set down his drink, waiting until she moved away before continuing. "Eduardo believes our dear Maria is holding out on him, that Pablo left more than just memories behind." Miguel felt the pieces sliding together, forming a picture he didn't want to see. The final cash, 300 million in bearer bonds and gold, hidden somewhere only Pablo knew. Carlos sipped his espresso, studying Miguel's reaction. But Pablo was paranoid in his final months. Started leaving breadcrumbs, insurance policies. If something happened to him, certain trusted individuals would know how to access his emergency fund. The cafe suddenly felt too small, too exposed. Miguel's eyes swept the surrounding tables, cataloging faces, looking for watchers. A man in a business suit read his newspaper too intently. A woman at the counter kept glancing toward their table between phone calls. "I don't know anything about hidden money." "Of course not." Carlos's smile was all teeth. "But Eduardo thinks you do, and more importantly, he thinks terrorizing Maria will flush you out of whatever hole you've been hiding in for 2 decades. He gestured around the cafe with mock grandeur. "Congratulations, hermano. His plan worked perfectly." Miguel stood again, this time meaning it. "I'm walking away." "No." The word cut through the morning air like a blade. "You're not." Something in Carlos's tone made Miguel freeze, not threat, something worse, certainty. You see, Miguel, Eduardo isn't just some punk with delusions of grandeur. He's connected, protected. The new cartels, the ones that rose from our ashes, they find him useful. Carlos leaned back in his chair, relaxed as a man discussing weather. And they're very interested in Pablo's missing fortune. Then let them find it themselves. They tried. For years they've been searching, digging, following every rumor and whisper. Carlos's eyes hardened. But Pablo was too clever. The secret died with him, except for the insurance policies he left behind. And those insurance policies are people, Miguel. Living people who carry pieces of a puzzle they don't even know they possess. Miguel's blood turned to ice. Maria, his children, his most trusted lieutenants. Carlos finished his espresso and set the cup down with finality. Anyone who spent those final months close enough to hear Pablo's whispered prayers and desperate preparations. The trap revealed itself in all its elegant cruelty. Miguel had come to Colombia to honor an old oath, to protect Pablo's family from a disrespectful nephew. But the nephew was just bait, the video just the lure. Someone much more dangerous was hunting Pablo Escobar's ghosts, and Miguel had just painted a target on his own back. I protected what needed protecting. Carlos dabbed his mouth with a napkin, the gesture almost feminine in its delicacy. Maria doesn't know I'm alive, better that way. But when Eduardo started circling her like a vulture, I had to act. By using me as bait. By calling in old debts. Carlos's voice hardened. You swore an oath, Miguel. Blood and family. Those words meant something once. Miguel felt the familiar ache behind his ribs. Not the gun, but something deeper. The place where he'd buried 23 years of guilt. Pablo's dead. The oath died with him. Did it? Carlos leaned forward again, close enough that Miguel could see the liver spots on his hands, the way his fingers trembled slightly around the coffee cup. Tell me, hermano, what do you dream about? In that quiet shop of yours, when the work stops and the silence gets too loud, what faces visit you? Miguel's jaw clenched. Carlos was fishing, but the hook found its mark anyway, because Miguel did dream. Always the same nightmare. Hacienda Nápoles, December 1993, Pablo's final Christmas party. The children running through rooms that would be morgues within weeks. Maria laughing at something her husband whispered, unaware that her world was already ending. And Miguel himself, standing guard while a family celebrated its last moments of peace. You remember the promise, Carlos continued, watching recognition flicker across Miguel's features. Pablo called you into his study that night. Just the two of you. What did he say? The memory rose unbidden. Pablo behind his massive mahogany desk, maps of Colombia spread like battle plans, his face gaunt with the weight of impending doom. The sirens were already getting closer, the government forces tightening their noose. Pablo knew his time was measured in days, maybe hours. If something happens to me, Pablo had said, my family will be alone in a world that hates our name. Promise me, Miguel. Promise me you'll watch over them, that you'll come when they call, no matter how long it takes, no matter how far you run. Miguel had knelt beside that desk, actually knelt, like a knight before his king, and sworn an oath that felt sacred in the moment. Blood and family unto death. I've spent 23 years keeping that promise, Miguel said, his voice rougher than he intended. Staying away, letting them build normal lives. Staying away was never the promise. Carlos's words cut deep. Protection was, and when Eduardo started hunting them, where were you? Fixing transmissions while Maria faced the wolves alone. Miguel's hands curled into fists beneath the table. She was safe in Argentina. The whole family was safe. Were they? Carlos pulled out his phone again, fingers dancing across the screen. Let me show you what your 2 decades of protection accomplished. The video that appeared wasn't the market humiliation Miguel had seen. This was older, grainier security footage from what looked like a parking garage. The timestamp read 3 months ago. Miguel watched Maria exit an elevator, moving with the careful dignity of a woman who'd learned to carry herself like armor. But as she approached her car, shadows detached themselves from concrete pillars. 3 men, young and hungry-looking. They didn't touch her, not at first, but they surrounded her, close enough that Miguel could read the fear in her posture even through the grainy footage. One of them spoke directly into her face, while the others laughed. Maria stood perfectly still, her purse clutched against her chest like a shield. The encounter lasted maybe 2 minutes. Then the men melted back into the shadows and Maria got into her car with hands that shook so badly she dropped her keys twice. Buenos Aires, Carlos said, closing the phone. 6 weeks later she booked a flight to Colombia. One way. You want to know why she came back? Because running wasn't working anymore. Because the past followed her across oceans and decades, and she finally realized that the only safety lay in facing it. Miguel felt something cold spreading through his chest. Not fear, but recognition. He'd been telling himself that distance was protection, that his absence kept the family safe. But Carlos was right. Miguel had built himself a comfortable lie while the people he'd sworn to protect faced threats alone. Eduardo found her in Argentina? Eduardo's just the local problem. The men in that parking garage work for people who make Eduardo look like a choir boy. Carlos stood, dropping bills on the table with casual precision. The new cartels have long memories and longer reach. They want Pablo's final cachet, and they're willing to torture his family to find it. Miguel remained seated, paralyzed by the magnitude of his failure. What do you want me to do? What you should have done 23 years ago. Carlos straightened his guayabera, preparing to leave. Come home, honor your oath, help me protect what's left of our family. And if I refuse? Carlos paused, his expression softening into something that might have been pity. Then Maria dies, Eduardo dies, and eventually they'll come for your mechanic boy in Miami anyway, because loose ends make powerful people nervous. He walked away without another word, leaving Miguel alone with his ghosts and the bitter taste of inevitability. His phone buzzed. A text from the Miami shop boss. That transmission you wanted me to check is making weird noises again. Should I take it apart? See Carlos, the boy who called him Jefe with genuine respect, who stayed late without being asked, who'd never known a world where violence solved problems. Miguel stared at the message until his vision blurred, remembering how the kid's face had lit up when Miguel showed him the proper way to rebuild a differential. Pure joy in honest work, something Miguel had forgotten existed until he found it again in that grease-stained shop. Now Carlos Henau's associates were watching that boy, photographing him, treating him like leverage in a game Miguel thought he'd quit playing. Miguel deleted the message without responding and called the number from the original video. You watched our little reunion, he said when the line connected. Carlos chuckled, the sound carrying perfectly across the digital void. Café Versalles has excellent acoustics, always did. The boy in Miami is perfectly safe as long as you're being reasonable. Which you are, aren't you, Miguel? Being reasonable. Miguel closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. What's the real play here, Carlos? Because none of this is about family honor or protecting Maria. Silence stretched across the connection, long enough that Miguel wondered if he'd overplayed his hand. When Carlos spoke again, his voice carried a different edge, sharper, hungrier. You always were too smart for your own good. Eduardo isn't acting alone. The video, the timing, bringing Maria back to Colombia. Someone's orchestrating this. Someone who needs all the players in one place. Miguel opened his eyes, scanning the cafe for watchers. The question is whether you're working with them or just another piece on the board. Does it matter? It does to me. Another pause, then Carlos's laughter, genuine this time, almost fond. You know what your problem was, Miguel? You thought loyalty meant friendship, that because Pablo trusted you, we were all brothers in arms. The words hit like a physical blow. Miguel felt something fundamental shift in his chest, a tectonic plate of belief cracking along fault lines he'd refused to acknowledge. I was never your brother, Carlos continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. I was Pablo's family, blood family, and when the empire fell, when the vultures came to pick our bones, I did what family does. I survived. Miguel's grip tightened on the phone. By faking your death. By being smart enough to disappear when the DEA thought they'd killed me. By spending 20 years building new alliances, new sources of income. Carlos paused, and Miguel could hear traffic in the background, the sound of a man on the move. By positioning myself to reclaim what was always ours. The revelation crystallized with sickening clarity. You're working with the new cartels. I am the new cartels in the ways that matter. Pablo's routes, his contacts, his methods. I've been selling that knowledge piecemeal for 2 decades. But the final cash, that stays in the family. Miguel felt the last illusions crumble. He'd spent 23 years believing he'd honored his oath by staying away, by letting the family heal. But Carlos had never been interested in healing. He'd been planning, positioning, using his own sister as bait in an elaborate trap designed to flush out the one man who might know Pablo's final secrets. "You son of a bitch," Miguel breathed. "Maria doesn't know, does she? She thinks her brother is dead, thinks Eduardo is the only threat. Maria thinks what she needs to think, just like you thought what you needed to think." Carlos's voice carried a note of satisfaction, the smugness of a chess master revealing his endgame. "Everyone plays their role perfectly when they don't know they're acting." Miguel stood from the table, his chair clattering backward. Several cafe patrons looked over with mild concern, but he barely noticed. The rage building in his chest was white-hot and familiar, the same fury that had made him Pablo's most feared enforcer, the anger he'd spent 2 decades learning to control. "Here's what you never understood about loyalty," Miguel said, his voice low and deadly. "It's not about blood or family names or oaths sworn in desperate moments." "No? Then what is it about?" Miguel was already walking toward the street, his free hand checking the Sig Sauer's position. "It's about choosing who deserves protection, and you just showed me exactly who that is." He ended the call and kept walking, leaving his old life's last illusion bleeding out on the cafe floor behind him. The Medellin streets blurred past in a kaleidoscope of familiar sights: vendor stalls selling arepas, children kicking a soccer ball between parked cars, old women in black dresses heading to evening mass. His city, still breathing, still alive despite everything that had bled into its soil. But now every face seemed suspect, every shadow a potential threat. Carlos had 20 years to build his network, and Miguel was walking through it blind. He ducked into a small electronics store, the kind that sold burner phones alongside knockoff headphones. The teenage clerk barely looked up from his video game as Miguel paid cash for a simple Nokia and prepaid minutes. Old habits: never trust the phone you came with, never assume the line is clean. Outside again, Miguel found an internet cafe wedged between a barber shop and a church. The irony wasn't lost on him. He paid for 30 minutes and chose a terminal in the back corner, positioned so he could watch both the entrance and the street through grimy windows. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard. For 23 years he'd maintained radio silence with everyone from his old life. No Google searches for familiar names, no social media stalking, no digital breadcrumbs that might lead back to his auto shop sanctuary. But Carlos had already shattered that protection. The game was in motion whether Miguel played or not. He started with Eduardo Henao. The search results painted a picture of calculated brutality dressed up as entrepreneurship. Eduardo owned 3 nightclubs in the Zona Rosa, had investments in a construction company that specialized in government contracts, and photographed well at charity galas. But buried in the local crime reports were Pattern's competitors who died in convenient accidents, witnesses who disappeared before trials, a trail of violence sanitized by expensive lawyers and strategic bribes. Miguel dug deeper, following financial threads through shell companies and holding firms. Eduardo's operation was sophisticated but not innovative. Everything traced back to roots and methods Pablo had pioneered 30 years ago, refined for a new generation of corruption. But the money flows were wrong. Too much capital for a regional player, too many international connections for someone who'd supposedly built his empire from scratch. Eduardo was well-funded, which meant he was well-connected, which meant Carlos was telling the truth about at least one thing: this wasn't just family drama. A new search, Maria Escobar, Argentina, past 5 years. The results made his chest tighten. Charity work with an orphanage in Buenos Aires, a quiet apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, doctor visits for what looked like stress-related conditions, and buried in the social pages of an expat newsletter, a photograph from 2 years ago: Maria at a fundraising dinner, smiling for the camera but looking fragile in a way that made Miguel's hands clench into fists. She'd aged well, but he could see the weight she carried, the careful way she held herself, the guarded expression even in moments of supposed joy. This was a woman who'd learned to sleep with one eye open, who'd spent decades waiting for the past to find her. And now it had. Miguel's phone, the new one, buzzed with an incoming call, unknown number, which in this context meant everything. "Miguel." The voice was female, accented with the cultured Spanish of old Medellin money. "Who is this?" "Someone who knew your patron. Someone who remembers when honor meant something in this business." A pause, traffic sounds in the background. "We need to meet. Lady, I don't... Plaza Botero, 1 hour, come alone and come armed. There are things you need to know before tonight." The line went dead. Miguel stared at the phone, his mind racing through possibilities. Another trap? Carlos tightening his web? or something else entirely, a wild card in a game that was already spinning beyond anyone's control? He thought about the boy back in Miami, probably closing up the shop about now, maybe grabbing dinner from the Cuban place next door. Safe in a world where problems were solved with wrenches and honest work, where violence was something that happened to other people in distant places. Miguel had built that sanctuary for both of them, the boy who needed a father figure, and the broken enforcer who needed to remember what peace felt like. But peace was a luxury he could no longer afford. He deleted his browser history and left the cafe, stepping back into streets that hummed with approaching darkness. The Plaza Botero was a 20-minute walk, past vendors closing their stalls and prostitutes beginning their evening shifts, past the monuments to Pablo's legacy, the violence, the corruption, the blood that still stained every corner of his beloved city, but also past the schools and clinics Pablo's money had built, the soccer fields where poor kids learned to dream of something better than the cartel life. The complicated truth of a complicated man who'd trusted Miguel with his family's safety. Miguel checked his watch and quickened his pace. Whatever was waiting for him at the plaza, whoever had called with promises of revelation, it was time to stop running from ghosts. It was time to honor the oath that had defined and damned him. Miguel positioned himself near the monument to the bird, one hand resting casually near his weapon. The plaza buzzed with evening energy couples sharing cigarettes on benches, street vendors hawking empanadas to late commuters, the eternal rhythm of a city that refused to die despite everything that had tried to kill it. "You came," the voice emerged from behind the sculpture of the woman with the apple. Miguel turned slowly, his body coiled for violence, and found himself face to face with a ghost. Isabella Restrepo stepped into the light, and 23 years collapsed into nothing. She'd been Pablo's lawyer, his confessor, the brilliant woman who'd helped build an empire's legal scaffolding. Miguel had assumed she was dead. So many of Pablo's inner circle had died in the chaos of 1993 that he'd stopped counting the bodies. But here she stood, silver-haired now, and wearing the understated elegance of old money, her dark eyes carrying the same sharp intelligence that had once terrified federal prosecutors. "Isabella," Miguel's voice came out rougher than intended. "Carlos said you were killed in a car bombing. Carlos has been saying many things lately, most of them lies." She moved closer, her heels clicking against stone with military precision. "Walk with me. The plaza has too many ears." They moved together through the sculpture garden, two aging players in a game that had supposedly ended decades ago. Miguel kept his peripheral vision sharp, cataloging exits and potential threats, but Isabella walked with the confidence of someone who owned the night. "How long have you known?" Miguel asked. "That Carlos faked his death? Since 1994, I helped arrange it." Isabella's admission landed like a physical blow. The DEA had blown up a safe house, found 3 bodies. It was easy enough to substitute dental records, to let everyone believe the Henao brother was finally dead. Miguel felt the architecture of his assumptions crumbling. "Why? Because he convinced me he wanted out. Said he was going to disappear, start over, let the family heal." Isabella's laugh carried no humor. "I was younger then, more naive about the possibility of redemption." They paused beside the sculpture of the reclining woman, her bronze flesh gleaming in the streetlight. Miguel studied Isabella's profile, reading 20 years of accumulated guilt in the lines around her eyes. "When did you realize he was lying?" "About 5 years ago, when my sources started reporting movement, money flowing through old channels, information being sold to new players." Isabella turned to face him directly. "Carlos never wanted out, Miguel. He wanted everyone else out so he could inherit the kingdom." The revelation crystallized Miguel's growing understanding. He's been systematically eliminating the old guard. Everyone who might challenge his version of history, everyone who knew Pablo's real secrets. Isabella's voice dropped to a whisper. "You were supposed to die in Miami 6 months ago. Car accident, very tragic, no investigation." Miguel's blood turned to ice water. "What stopped it?" "Me." Isabella reached into her purse and Miguel's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, but she only produced a manila envelope thick with documents. "I've been watching, preparing, building a case." Miguel accepted the envelope, feeling its weight like a millstone. "What's in here?" "Everything. Financial records, communication logs, photographs, 20 years of Carlos selling Pablo's legacy to the highest bidder." Isabella's eyes burned with old fury, including the buyer's list for Pablo's final cash location. The world tilted sideways. Miguel gripped the envelope harder, his mind racing through implications. "He already sold the information? 3 times to 3 different cartels. Let them fight over fake coordinates while he prepares to claim the real prize." Isabella checked her watch. a gesture that reminded Miguel painfully of the old days. Maria doesn't know any of this. She thinks she's protecting her son by cooperating with Eduardo, thinks her brother is dead and buried. Where is she now? Safe house in El Poblado. Eduardo's keeping her comfortable while Carlos orchestrates his endgame. Isabella moved closer, her voice urgent. Miguel, there's something else, something that changes everything. She pulled out her phone, fingers flying across the screen. The photograph that appeared made Miguel's world stop spinning. A man in expensive clothes entering a government building in Bogotá, distinguished, confident, wearing the uniform of legitimate power. But Miguel recognized the face despite 20 years of expensive surgery and political polish. Carlos Henao, very much alive, shaking hands with Colombia's Minister of Justice. He's not just selling drugs anymore, Isabella said quietly. He's selling policy, information, access. She closed the phone, her expression grim. Carlos isn't trying to rebuild Pablo's empire, Miguel. He's trying to replace it with something worse: legitimacy. Miguel felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place, revealing a picture so twisted it took his breath away. The brother who'd faked his death to gain power, the nephew who'd built an empire on stolen knowledge, the elaborate charade designed to flush out the last man who could expose the truth, and at the center of it all, Maria still believing in family loyalty while her brother prepared to sacrifice her for the keys to a kingdom she'd never wanted. Miguel looked up from the envelope, his eyes finding Isabella's in the amber light. Tell me how to save her. Carlos expects you to come for Maria directly, Isabella explained, her voice carrying the same clinical precision she'd once used in courtrooms. Eduardo's compound in El Poblado, heavily defended, multiple escape routes. Walking in means walking into a killing box. Miguel nodded, his mind already mapping alternatives. So we don't give him what he expects. Exactly, Isabella smiled, and for a moment Miguel glimpsed the brilliant strategist who'd once outmaneuvered federal prosecutors. We give him something better. The operation took 3 days to arrange. Isabella's network lawyers, judges, journalists, who remembered when truth mattered more than survival, moved like ghosts through Medellin's power structure. Evidence flowed to strategic hands. Photographs found their way to newspaper editors who still had spines. Financial records landed on the desks of honest prosecutors who thought they'd died extinct. Miguel spent those days becoming someone he'd hoped never to be again. The auto mechanic's careful movements gave way to an assassin's fluid grace. He acquired weapons through Isabella's contacts, studied building schematics, planned entry routes, and kill shots with the cold efficiency that had once made him Pablo's most feared enforcer. On the third night, Carlos's carefully constructed world began to collapse. The story broke simultaneously across 3 major newspapers. Dead cartel leader's secret government connection exposed. Photographs of Carlos with ministers, judges, police commanders. Financial records showing millions in bribes flowing through shell companies. 20 years of corruption laid bare in black and white. Miguel watched the news coverage from a hotel room overlooking El Poblado, his phone buzzing with frantic calls that he ignored. Carlos's network was hemorrhaging, associates scrambling to distance themselves from a scandal that threatened to bring down half the government. At 11:47 p.m., a black SUV raced from Eduardo's compound toward the airport. Through binoculars, Miguel counted 3 figures in the vehicle Eduardo driving, Carlos in the passenger seat, and a woman in the back who could only be Maria. Miguel followed at a distance, Isabella's voice crackling through his earpiece with updates. Airport security's been compromised. They're heading for a private hangar. Let them run, Miguel replied, his hands steady on the wheel. We're not stopping them tonight. What? Isabella's confusion was audible. Miguel, this is our chance. This is our proof. The SUV pulled into Hangar 7, where a small jet sat fueled and ready. Miguel parked in the shadows and activated the recording equipment. Isabella had provided military-grade surveillance gear that would capture everything in crystal clarity. Through the telephoto lens, he watched Carlos drag Maria from the vehicle while Eduardo argued with the pilot. Even at this distance, Miguel could see Maria's terror, the way she stumbled as her brother forced her toward the aircraft. This wasn't protection. This was kidnapping. Carlos paused at the jet's stairs, scanning the darkness as if he sensed watching eyes. For a moment his face turned toward Miguel's position, and even through the camera lens, Miguel felt the malevolent intelligence that had orchestrated this elaborate betrayal. Then Carlos smiled, a cold expression that spoke of triumph and contempt, and pushed Maria into the plane. Miguel lowered the camera and reached for his phone. The call connected on the second ring. Prosecutor General's office. This is Miguel Herrera. I have evidence of a kidnapping in progress at Jorge Newbery Airport, Hangar 7. I'm transmitting video now. Isabella's network had done its work. The prosecutor who answered was one of the few clean officials left in Colombia, a woman whose integrity had survived 3 decades of bribes and death threats. She listened to Miguel's terse report with the focus of someone who understood that justice was a luxury that required perfect timing. Units are en route, she confirmed. Keep the channel open. Miguel watched through the lens as federal vehicles surrounded the hangar, their lights painting the night in urgent reds and blues. The jet's engines were spooling up, but there was nowhere to run. Carlos's empire of shadows couldn't survive in democracy's harsh fluorescent light. The arrest footage would play for weeks on every news channel in Colombia. Carlos Henao, the dead man who'd lived 20 years in plain sight, dragged from a private jet in handcuffs. His nephew, Eduardo, the new generation cartel leader, screaming about diplomatic immunity while prosecutors read charges that would keep him imprisoned until his hair turned white. And Maria Escobar, Pablo's widow, the woman Miguel had sworn to protect, walking free across the tarmac, no longer a prisoner of her family's bloody legacy. Miguel watched until the last police car disappeared into Medellin's neon maze. Then he set the camera aside and drove toward the airport's commercial terminal, where Isabella waited with tickets to Buenos Aires. "It's finished," she said when he joined her at the departure gate. Miguel nodded, feeling something fundamental shift in his chest. Not peace exactly, but the absence of weight he'd carried for 23 years. "Yeah, it's finished." The plane lifted off at dawn, carrying them away from a city that had finally learned to bury its ghosts. Through the window, Miguel watched Medellin shrink to toy size below, its sprawling barrios and glittering towers reduced to patterns of light and shadow. Somewhere down there, Maria was probably sitting in a prosecutor's office, giving testimony that would ensure Carlos never walked free again. Somewhere, the boy in Miami was opening the auto shop, wondering why Miguel hadn't called. And somewhere in the space between duty and redemption, between the man he'd been and the man he might become, Miguel Herrera finally allowed himself to rest. The oath was fulfilled, the debt was paid, the story was over. But as the plane banked south toward Argentina, toward whatever waited beyond the horizon, Miguel found himself thinking not of endings but beginnings. There were other families who needed protection, other debts that demanded payment, other chances to choose who deserved saving. Pablo's empire had fallen. Carlos's network lay in ruins. But the work, the real work of standing between the innocent and those who would devour them, that work was never finished. Miguel closed his eyes and let the plane carry him toward tomorrow, where new ghosts waited and old debts called for collection. In his pocket, Isabella had placed an address in Buenos Aires, a safe house, where certain conversations happened, where certain services were arranged for those who had nowhere else to turn. He'd built one sanctuary in Miami. Perhaps it was time to build another. The engines hummed their mechanical lullaby, and for the first time in 23 years, Miguel Herrera slept without dreaming of blood.